Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Now, you may have heard the news yesterday that Nigel Farage has made a very, very, very serious accusation in the face of Jeremy Corbyn regarding the fact that Nigel Farage seems to be under the impression that Jeremy Corbyn believes that the world is run by a secret Jewish organization or something like that. Basically, I'll get into a little bit more of this later, but actually I kind of want to do this video a little bit differently than what you might imagine. We're actually just going to check this out in its entirety. It's on GB News, so, well, you know immediately there what this is going to be. So, Nigel Farage warns UK will have serious Islamist force in Parliament by 2029, which is only 5 years away. And they seem to think that the UK is going to be invaded. So, let's because I had a very interesting a take on this, but wait until you guys hear it. I'll get to it in the end. So I hope you enjoy listening to Nigel Farage, I guess.
To stand for Parliament.
I think an awful lot of people want to become MPs because they really, really want to do good and they want to help. I mean, so many people are so rude about MPs. I would have a rule that you can't apply to be an MP until you've done 10 years' work in the real world, even if it's only shelf stacking. Just be out there. There are too many MPs now who've never actually worked other than in Parliament or around Parliament, and I think that's not good.
I think in 1997, only two of us had actually come from an authentic working class background. Clive Efford had been a cab driver, and I'd been a bus driver.
Wow. Is that in the New Labour intake?
I know, in the New Labour, because the other place, they're full of university
lecturers.
Lawyers.
It's not right, because you're not
in Poland,
talking.
you cannot actually stand unless you have a university education.
Which is crazy.
Which is the wrong way round, really.
It's absolutely crazy.
Let's pause this here, because there is one man who is pretty proud.
I didn't pause it. I was enjoying that discussion. That seemed actually rather more interesting.
Of the fact that he's not always been in politics. Of course, he worked in business before getting involved in not one, but three now political parties, I suppose. Nigel Farage, the GB News presenter and honorary president of Reform UK, joins us now.
Oh, God.
Nigel, thanks for, I don't know if you're still running on American time. I know you've recently got back from the United States, but thank you for being up for us. Frankly, I'm looking at the Reform expectations here. Reform has not done well tonight.
No, it hasn't. And very simple reason, it mobilised too late. You know, when you call a by-election...
Mobilised too late. Again, I'm going to just lay this out here, ladies and gentlemen, because I did an entire video. I dedicated 90 whole minutes of my life basically slating the hell out of the Reform Party's policies. And if you want to see what those are, you can check them out via the Reform Party's website, or you can check out the video I did some weeks ago about the Reform Party's policies and what they actually mean. So bear that in mind when Farage uses terms like mobilization.
Like this, at very short notice, and when there are 24,000 postal votes in the constituency, unless you move incredibly quickly, you are behind the curve. We know that it's a 40% turnout. What we don't yet know is what percentage of that will be postal votes. I bet you it's 60%, maybe even higher. And by the time Simon Danchuk had mobilised his campaign, a local independent candidate had set himself up for the anti-Galloway vote and has clearly done very well. So no, not a great result for Reform. You're quite right. However, a very deeply disturbing, worrying vote for British politics and for our future. And as you well know, Tom, for the last few weeks, I've been saying sectarian politics has arrived. People voting purely on religious lines. I'm told from the count, there were some wards where when the boxes were opened, it was 95% Galloway. And here's the problem. If you have mass postal voting, people get signed up for votes. Literally, they're collected from the door minutes after the postman arrives. It is open to threats. It is open to intimidation. I have tried repeatedly over the last decade and more to say, if we want good election results, if we want to get intimidation out of British politics, we have to go back to postal voting as it was before Tony Blair became PM. This will be a victory for Galloway achieved on the back of postal votes.
That is an extraordinary piece of news that you've brought us, if it turns out to be true, that in some of these boxes it seemed like 95% of the votes were going Galloway. These are North Korean levels of support, Nigel Farage.
When the postman delivers the postal vote, and when somebody's 100 yards...
I do say, Nigel Farage, we are approaching North Korean levels of completely unbiased, almost religious voting, Farage. Please, Farage, I can't take it anymore. Farage, please, Farage, yes, come on, we like a bit of Nigel. Come on, Nigel, yes, Nigel, please, give us more Nigel. That's right, yes, Nigel, yes. Okay, sorry, I think I got a bit carried away there, sorry.
Behind the postman down the street and knocks on the door and says, I've come to collect your postal vote. They literally say, look, I'm not going to go until I collect it. They physically stand there as somebody puts their cross in the box. This, I'm afraid, is what you get with a combination of postal voting on demand and sectarian politics. And you only had to hear the appalling words of Chris Williamson to realise where we're going. Now, I think as far as this year's election is concerned, Labour will get bitten. They will get bitten by this. Irresponsible immigration policies, divided communities, us being told that we all bow down to the god of diversity. Well, here it is. But the implications going on to 2029, remember, the Muslim population has risen by 44% in the last 10 years. I've seen sectarian voting in Northern Ireland along Protestant and Catholic lines. We are going to have, a serious Islamist force in Parliament by 2029.
That is a profound prediction. I wonder, Nigel, does one risk encouraging that sectarianism by engaging in discussions like this? If it's an Islamist force on this side versus everyone else, is there not a duty, perhaps, on mainstream politicians to reach out to Muslim voters to say there's a way to go past these sectarian lines?
I'd love to think so, Tom, but I said this first after the Bradford West by-election, which I witnessed in 2012. I said then, are we going to see sectarianism in British politics? I saw the Oldham by-election of 2015, where the Guardian's northern correspondent went down a street in Oldham with an interpreter, and she wrote, nobody in the street spoke English. Very few recognised the name Jeremy Corbyn, yet they all said they voted Labour. This is voting along religious lines where the imam has enormous sway over what people do. This has been to Labour's great advantage up until now. It is, I think, in the next few years, going to come back and bite them. And of course, I don't welcome this. I think it's a catastrophe. I think a by-election campaign that we've just seen in which, Simon Danczuk was threatened with a bullet in the head, where, a local woman running a burger van who'd put up a Danczuk poster was told they'd burn the van down. I mean, this is very, very frightening. And just think about the words of Chris Williamson. Just think about the appalling, I think, comparison that he drew between Gaza and Auschwitz, and realise, I'm sorry, folks, this is here to stay. It is,
as you say, an appalling comparison, and one that frankly terminated our interview with him. But Nigel, going back to where Reform is, a party you're honorary president of, there are votes in this seat that are going to people who aren't.
You want to talk a little bit about of diversity and all that? Notice how he uses the term president. Why exactly, in the span of British politics, why do we need a president? Why don't we have, a minister or a lord or the prime minister? Because, as I discussed a lot about this when I talked about the actual policies of the Reform Party, is that they seem to almost be ostensibly tranced with the idea of the worship of Donald Trump, aka wanting to turn UK politics into something more resembling the Republicans from the Americans, that's sort of what it underlines. And again, using the term president only expands or even determines this philosophy even further. And bear in mind, Farage is quite good friends with Donald Trump, so you wonder who is influencing who and why they're trying to convince us that so many of these things are going on. But I'll come back to that a little bit later.
George Galloway, but it seems like perhaps the anti-Galloway, anti-establishment vote seems to be coalescing around a guy called David Tully, an independent candidate. Should Reform have selected a different candidate? Was the fact that the candidate Reform selected was a former Labour MP who had to leave in not the best circumstances after a scandal involving texts sent to a 17-year-old girl? Was that a bad move for the Reform Party? Was that a bad candidate selection?
Yes, it was.
It's possible that that's a factor, but the real factor is they were too late. I repeat, they were too late.
Yeah, it might have been. Let's move on to how we did too late. Let's completely. Yes, well done, Nigel Farage. Like any politician or any president, answer the question by completely ignoring it. Good job, Nigel.
Once those postal votes, I mean, don't forget, this by-election ended 2 weeks ago. This was over 2 weeks ago because of the weight of postal votes. And Danchuk came to this by-election, this very short, quick by-election, relatively late. That was the biggest problem. Plus, Reform's problem is that it can fight an air war in a general election. It doesn't really have the troops and the organisation yet to fight a by-election on the ground effectively.
And this is a very interesting conversation. We were talking with Jacob Rees-Mogg a moment ago about the fact that by-elections don't generally get the attention in the broadcast media that general elections do because of the restrictions placed upon by-election reporting, the restrictions on talking about candidates, the tiptoeing around that all broadcasters must do due to the regulations that we operate under. Is there a case for liberalising those regulations during by-elections, during the Purdah period, in order to examine exactly what's going on?
There is perhaps a case for it. I mean, I have to say, I've been deeply frustrated over the course of the last week, not being able on my show on GB News to give reports of what I've been hearing directly from friends on the ground. But remember, by-elections they're like massive artillery wars. People pile in huge numbers of troops on both sides, and houses sometimes get 20 or 30 leaflets during a by-election. I can remember going back as UKIP leader, well-fought by-elections and the candidate gets 6 or 8%, and then a paper candidate in a general election in the same seat gets 16% or 18%. So by-elections are very, very different. It's clear that a local businessman who's popular and well-known has got the anti-Galloway vote. And that's interesting. But frankly, nobody really is going to be analysing the score that the Conservatives, the Lib Dems or Reform got. What we need to think about are the implications of what Galloway's done. And I would urge this Conservative government, as I've been doing ever since 2010, and I've spoken to Boris Johnson and all of them, I would urge them, please think about the integrity of elections. Please stop mass postal voting. Let's have a system like France, a system like we used to have, where you get a postal vote if you apply for one. You have to have a reason. You're out of the country.
So now Farage is talking about being more like the French. I thought he was supposed to be a Reform Party for Britain, not for the... Why are we taking cues from the French? You may be saying, Mr. Farage, because I think it's when they say things like mass postal voting and stuff like that is the thing that makes me suggest that if you apply for one, so does it involve that... Basically, I was going to say this until the end, but I'll just say it now. Part of what I feel like has happened, and I'll talk a lot more about the actual election and George Galloway separately, but a lot of this, you could argue that very much this all comes down to we are very, very shocked that somebody is actually voting for somebody else as opposed to us. That's, to be honest, that's what I feel like this all boils down to, that they're just hacked off, that somebody else got the vote, and they say this is a threat to our democracy. Rishi Sunak has even been on the warpath himself and has shown, and I'll talk about this when we talk about that surprise announcement from Downing Street from yesterday, but a lot of this seems to come down to the fact that they just seem, it could be easy from the outside perspective, and I'll talk about that in a bit, that from the outside perspective, they're just hacked off and think that somehow things have to seriously be done if they're going to allow someone like Galloway be elected to Rochdale. But again, if you need to be reminded about some very serious issues that have been happening in Rochdale for nearly 20 years, you might possibly want to look into sort of Rochdale's history involving a lot of the CPS failings regarding the Greater Manchester Police, regarding grooming gangs that have been happening, not just in Rochdale, but we're talking in Bolton, in Blackburn, a lot of sort of the region of, of Lancashire and Greater Manchester. But again, you might want to conduct that separately, because this is really a can of worms being opened, but I'm not entirely sure Farage is sort of looking at this the same way I am.
You're 97 in a wheelchair, and where postal votes would be about 2 to 2.5% of the overall turnout, and then make people turn up on the day at the polling station with valid ID, and that way we will get
Objection.
less.
People should bring valid ID no matter what. If it was a by-election or a general election, valid ID shouldn't even. It should be brought as a matter of course. It's not really that's not really up for debate. But I don't really understand why Farage suddenly thinks that, people coming up without ID and say, you know what, they're coming en masse and they don't need ID at all, so they'll just have free reins to whoever they vote for, which is, again, an issue I might want to point out too, but, I think I've mentioned this before.
Abuse. In 2019 in Peterborough, and the Brexit Party were neck and neck with Labour. On the day of the poll, somebody walked in to a central wall polling station in Peterborough with a Tesco's bag with 1,000 votes in it. That sort of thing simply has to stop. And if we want to stop Galloway, we want to stop extremism, and maybe we can't, but we should at least go back to having sensible voting patterns and end this idea that postal voting is a good idea because it's convenient.
It's fascinating hearing you talking about this, but there will be some who say that limiting the reasons for getting a postal vote is simply an act of voter suppression. It will lead to fewer people engaging in our democracy. What do you say to those challenges?
It'll lead to fewer people being intimidated on their doorsteps. It'll lead to fewer women in certain communities being signed up for a vote and never even seeing the ballot paper. And it'll also mean that we vote on the same day with the same level of knowledge about a campaign and the arguments that have played out. The idea, as I say, that this by-election was over 2 weeks ago, frankly, makes the whole thing a farce.
No, it's a fascinating issue. Nigel, just looking at the figure that George Galloway is, some people might say he's a powerful orator. He's one of these larger-than-life characters. Does the House of Commons need more people like that? Because I remember sitting next to you here at this desk at the last by-election. You had some pretty choice words for people that were elected for the Labour Party who you described as perhaps not the greatest orators in the world. What Westminster...
I'm just going to have to interject this for 1 second, is that they're not asking for people to be the greatest orator. What matters is what you do say. That's what I think is more important. Because people will listen to you if you talk sense. You don't have to recite the whole of Paradise Lost or some epic poem to win voter support. What you need is somebody who has a very clear set idea, something that is well communicated, and something that people will understand and get behind. Because with contemporary politics, people need to be up to date and know exactly what's going on at the very moment. I mean, for a couple of weeks ago, I even came up with one a couple of weeks ago, and it was simply called Starmer for Britain, Sunak for Rwanda. And it highlighted, in my opinion, that Sunak, and when Braverman was still the Home Secretary, that the great need at the moment was more to get migrants over to Rwanda, and literally everything else that was happening in this country right now was somewhat secondary, from poverty to forced labor, stuff like that. So it stands to reason, ladies and gentlemen, or at least from what I understand of it, because again, it's one of those things that seems to have been shelved for the moment, but you can make of that what you will. It's simple, it's to the point, and it's something that, again, as someone who is a very pro-Labour voter, that's just how I'm going to see it.
Will certainly face is a force on the Green benches now.
No, I mean, the last couple that won were absolute muppets, weren't they? I mean, they could barely string a sentence together. And that was reading it off a piece of paper. George Galloway...
Just, again, make another point, is that, for someone who knows quite a lot about, who's been in America, and someone who knows a lot about American politics, like Farage does, I would hate to be the bringer of bad news to bring up a certain president called Roosevelt. You know how he was crippled with polio, and his wife had to help him out with his speeches? He probably may have not been described as the greatest orator in the world, but, well, there you go. Now, you may argue that making the comparison from a president from 80 years ago seems somewhat of a last-ditch effort to say that to make the argument about being an orator a pro or con, but I just feel like it's worth pointing out there, because what I want these people to understand is that, you know what, there are some people who are not great orators, but through reasons that are completely out of their control. That's the sort of thing I'm trying to emphasize. So let's not try and, discriminate people who are disabled who would want to get into politics. You know what? I can't imagine the day will come when they suddenly remove an accessibility ramp from outside Parliament, if that makes sense.
Do you know something? I think George is perhaps the best orator I've ever heard. And during the referendum campaign, George and I did work together. And it was really notable that Bradford, a city with a huge Muslim population, voted no, voted to leave. So George is enormously powerful, very charismatic. And even though I disagree with him profoundly on things, on a one-to-one basis, I struggle not to like him. But I'm afraid he is now using that power, that ability, that personality in a way that will divide our country horrendously. I'm old enough, Tom, to remember...
There you are, ladies and gentlemen. It's summarised there, right there. He's very, very good, but I dislike him now because he's not on our side.
What sectarian politics looked like in Northern Ireland, and I now fear it's come to England.
So... That's about that, ladies and gentlemen. And I suppose the only thing I could really say to this, to the actual title, is whether or not a serious Islamist force will be in Parliament by 2029. All I've got to say, and I don't know if you've ever watched the show One Foot in the Grave, but I'm going to repeat a very interesting catchphrase from it. I don't believe it. There you are. It's as simple as that. I don't believe it. I don't believe it when they say democracy is at threat for the reasons that they seem to suggest, owing to Galloway's victory. I don't believe it when they say a serious Islamist force will be in Parliament by 2029. Because, do you guys remember the reasons when, during the end of the Second World War, when it was decreed that no party should have the sort of influence and power that the Nazi party had in Germany? There's reasons why we have that in place. So there won't be any legitimate party, whether it's Labour, Reform, Lib Dem, or Conservative, will ever have that amount of power anyway. And as to the comment about people voting on religious lines, that's like that. It's an idea that is borderline ridiculous on the face of it, because guess what? If that's true, and you fundamentally believe, but then again, if you mean to say if Rishi Sunak and Starmer brought up God into all this, then do you think that would really sway people? Really? I mean, again, let's think about tangible things that are actually going on in the real world. You can't say that, again, things are going to be fixed, like the economy is going to be on the up again whilst we're in a recession, because if we pray hard enough, God is going to relieve us from our woes. I really don't know how to say this, ladies and gentlemen, but it's not going to work like that. I'm very, very sorry, but you know what? Welcome to the real world. If God was going to solve our problems, we would have converted years ago. Absolutely. And of course, one thing I really actually have to really put it into practice right now, ladies and gentlemen, just before we end this, because I will talk about George Galloway later on, but it's very, very... It all comes across as they're just hacked off that someone has won a position, someone they never expected to win a position, and because of Galloway's stance, it makes them think that there's something wicked going on that makes them think that democracy is at threat. You may have heard that Rishi Sunak was talking about mob rule a couple of days ago. Once again, I said it before and I'll say it again. Rishi Sunak's fear of the mob is a superstitious fear, because the mob is in fact loose now in the form of fat, rich businessmen who don't want to sacrifice their wealth for the world and will use their wealth to make sure that they stay in power forever. AKA confronting the police in terms of making them use very borderline excessive policing. And if you want a reminder of what sort of excessive policing looks like, go back to the miners' strike of the 1980s, when even the late Elizabeth II even had to call the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, to say, I'm not very happy about the way the police are conducting their business. Get in there and stop this at once. That's the sort of excessive force we have, ladies and gentlemen. And like I said, I don't believe there's going to be a serious Islamist force in Parliament in 5 years. I don't really believe that Nigel Farage nor GB News are sadly going to be a thing in 5 years' time, because people are going to see their rigmarole for what it really is. And I don't even think the Reform Party is going to be a thing in 5 years, because, like I mentioned before, their whole thing has the stink of an authoritarian police state that is basically an extremist version of the Republican Party led by Donald Trump. So that's exactly what it is, and that's all I got to say about that. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Take care, and bye-bye for now.